Westerns have been around pretty much as long as films have been around. What many regard to be the first narrative film was a western called The Great Train Robbery. This was released in 1903. Westerns continued to play a big role in cinema up until about the 1970s, with names such as Clint Eastwood, John Wayne, John Ford and Sergio Leone being absolute powerhouses in the genre. But in 1964, with the release of A Fistful of Dollars, Sergio Leone created his own subgenre, the spaghetti western. With his continuation of the Dollars trilogy with For a Few Dollars More and then of course The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, Leone is one of, if not the most acclaimed western directors. He propelled Clint Eastwood to stardom, making him perhaps the most recognisable name in western films, and his style eventually became the trademark of westerns as a whole. When people think of classic westerns, more likely than not they think of the final showdown in The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, or a mysterious man hunted down outlaws in the pursuit of money or revenge. Almost all of these classic tropes can be traced back to the spaghetti western and Leone, and that is why I believe the reasons westerns are seen as so cool is because of Leone and his films. Sure, westerns before him established the settings, some of the tropes, etc, but Leone elevated the genre to a new level. But what makes his films so special, and why have they become so ingrained in popular culture? I believe to answer this we can look at 4 of Leone's films. Firstly, we have A Fistful of Dollars, which centres around Clint Eastwood riding into town ruled by 2 rival gangs. He then joins both of them and pits them against each other, ending in both gangs dead and Eastwood with all their money. For a Few Dollars More is about rival bounty hunters Eastwood and Lee Van Cleef in the pursuit of the outlaw El Indio. They eventually team up and take down the outlaw and his gang together. The Good, the Bad and the Ugly has 3 main characters. The Good, which is a mysterious drifter played by Clint Eastwood. The Bad, a sadistic and ruthless mercenary dressed in all black played by Van Cleef. And the Ugly, a fast-talking bandito played by Eli Wallach. These 3 characters are in the search of lost Confederate gold amidst the backdrop of the Civil War. Finally, we have Once Upon a Time in the West. This is about a mysterious drifter teaming up with a bandito to defend a widow from an infamous mercenary on the backdrop of a dying West, with the railroad bringing civilization and the end to the era of gunslingers and outlaws. As you can probably tell, plot-wise these films definitely have similar themes, but when put together they allow us to clearly understand Leone's style and identify the common elements that have become so instrumental to the genre. And I believe these elements are also the main reason westerns have become so iconic and just so cool. But firstly, let's look at the context surrounding these films, as that can help us get a greater understanding of their rise to fame. European westerns had been around for a long time before Sergio Leone, but it was with the release of A Fistful of Dollars that the spaghetti western was really born, and it created the model for future films of this style. This model centred around a gruff and laconic hero with almost superhuman skills with a gun. This contrasts the slick and clean-shaven hero seen in American westerns, John Wayne being the best example. This hero would usually join a gang to further his own agenda, and there would often be an old man, typically an undertaker or a barman, who acts as his sidekick, and an eccentric Mexican bandit. Many future Italian films followed this blueprint, such as Blood for a Silver Dollar and A Pistol for Ringo. This subgenre then went on to be influenced by Leone's For a Few Dollars More, and of course The Good, the Bad and the Ugly made waves in the genre, and is probably the most iconic western of them all. However, back in the 60s when these films were coming out, many American critics saw them as a problem. For them, they represented the true beginning of an Italian invasion of an American genre, as up until then, Italian westerns remained mainly in Italy and Europe. These American critics focused on the graphic and cynical violence on display, and a lack of commitment to a strong sense of realism, and they saw these aspects as a threat to their previously all-American genre. However, time has obviously been very kind to Leone's films, as they go down as some of the best westerns of all time and dominate the genre as a whole. Perhaps the initial opposition to them actually helped them come across as more cool, as they went against the status quo. But what was the conception of these films? What were they based off and what allowed them to come into being? As I said before, Italian cinema was no stranger to the western genre. However, where Leone's films differ is they're more of a satire, taking the tropes to the extreme. Leone's deconstruction of the Old West romanticism is set up in A Fistful of Dollars by portraying the protagonist as an anti-hero. Eastwood creates a war between 2 rival factions for his own gain, and just isn't really that great of a guy. While he does free a family from the gang's grasp, his ultimate aim is to just make himself some money, regardless of anyone else. This could be seen as a critique of the American ideology of greed, as at the end of the day, the only thing pretty much all the characters want in the Dollars trilogy is money. These anti-heroes can be seen in pretty much all of Leone's westerns. The Good in The Good, the Bad and the Ugly isn't really that good, and an infamous outlaw, the Ugly, is one of our main protagonists. The only truly morally good protagonist I can think of is Harmonica from Once Upon a Time in the West, but then again he is paired with the outlaw Cheyenne. This satire can also be seen in the over-the-top use of violence, with our characters killing anyone who so much looks at them wrong. So obviously part of the concept of Leone's films is a satire of the western genre, replacing the heroic cowboy popularised by John Wayne with more morally complex anti-heroes seen with Clint Eastwood's characters. This satire and the fact that they don't take themselves too seriously makes these films stand apart from other westerns, and perhaps contributes to their coolness. It's also worth noting that A Fistful of Dollars is heavily influenced and is almost a direct remake of Kurosawa's Yojimbo. Both involve our central characters arriving at a town with two competing gangs vying for supremacy. He then joins both gangs and pits them against each other. Kurosawa even said in a letter to Leone that his film was a very fine film, but it is my film. This heavy influence led to Leone surrendering the Asian rights to Kurosawa, but despite this influence, A Fistful of Dollars did have its own directional style and saw the beginning of the rise of the spaghetti western overseas. Perhaps the most obvious answer to what makes westerns so cool is the setting. The sun-beaten American West, small towns isolated from any form of wider society, and obviously the lawlessness that puts the wild in Wild West are a key part of any western film. This setting really lays the groundwork for all further elements of these films, and it sets the stage for bounty hunters, outlaws, banditos, and all the common characters we expect to see. It also has an element of ruggedness to it, as it is a harsh place to live both in terms of the climate and the people, with the arid landscape and the constant threat of outlaws. I believe this setting is no better realised in the scene from Once Upon a Time in the West, when Frank and his gang kill the McBain family. The first half of this scene established a physical element to the setting. This is your classic homestead. The inhabitants are hunting and farming in order to provide for themselves. The constant cricket sounds add an element of barrenness to this setting, giving a feeling of isolation. These crickets intermittently stop, creating an ominous sense of foreboding. Perhaps there are other forces at play, and they are not as alone as they thought. Of course, this sense of foreboding comes to a head when Frank and his gang attack, massacring the whole family with no remorse, even killing a defenceless child at point blank. This establishes the lawlessness and shows how outlaws can take advantage of this isolation, and that the climate is not the only threat. But Leone does put a spin on the setting we know and love. A Fistful of Dollars has an almost Cold War-like rivalry between two gangs. The Good, the Bad and the Ugly obviously has a civil war setting, which only adds to the lawlessness as Leone portrays this war as chaotic. This is seen with the drunk Union captain who wants to blow up the bridge he's supposed to defend. Once Upon a Time in the West centres around the expansion of the railway, and how the West is almost being tamed and becoming more civilised, with rich businessmen replacing outlaws and gunslingers, and that money, rather than notoriety, is a new symbol of power, shown by the disabled railway baron. So this setting of isolation and lawlessness is paramount to what makes westerns so special, as they are the driving force of the plot and help establish just a cool and unique vibe, but Leone does add his own spin to this setting, giving each of his films a greater sense of identity. As well as a similar setting, all of Leone's westerns have a similar and distinct style. Leone's signature direction is really what cemented him as one of the most acclaimed western directors, but what is his style? Well, the first thing you notice is probably the use of music. Ennio Morricone's amazing score for all of Leone's films established the soundscape of the western genre as a whole, with his work on The Good, the Bad and the Ugly being some of the most iconic film music of all time. He perfectly encapsulates the spirit of the West with the use of whistles and harmonicas to create a sense of isolation and barrenness, but the use of trumpets and singing also add an element of grandness and intensity, with the final showdown at the end of The Good, the Bad and the Ugly sounding incredibly climactic. This music is very much at the heart of Leone's films, as it was composed before or alongside the screenplay, and he often played the music on set so the actors could hear and act in time to it. This emphasis on music certainly pays off, and it almost replaces the dialogue at times. Many of the scenes have no speech but just a music blaring, and they are still very compelling. This leads on to another aspect of Leone's style. He uses very little dialogue for the most part. Of course there are exceptions, such as Tuco in The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, but most of Leone's characters are not very talkative at all. Eastwood's characters and harmonica from Once Upon a Time in the West are probably the best example of this laconicness. This elevates a mystery surrounding them and makes them come across as more intimidating and calculating. This is probably where the silent badass character archetype originated, influencing Anton Chigurh in No Country for Old Men or the driver in Drive. Other aspects of Leone's style include his excessive use of extreme close-ups, once again adding to the intensity and helps give his characters more status at times. He expertly progresses scenes with nothing but the close-up on a face and of course some music blaring in the background. The almost superhuman skill with weapons that most of his characters possess also adds an element of whimsy to the worlds he creates, making sure they don't become too grounded in reality, as ultimately these films are just grown-up fairy tales for American dads. Honestly, I don't think I'm smart enough to fully analyse Leone's direction, but he can certainly portray a lot without saying much. For all the factors I just talked about and more, Leone's films have such a unique feeling. He doesn't take himself too seriously, but still manages to tell the story he wants to tell and get an emotional response out of the audience. So I believe his directional style is a key reason why his films are so cool, and it makes the western genre as a whole just come across as way more special. Ultimately, Leone's style is so iconic it's become synonymous with westerns as a whole and has led to numerous parodies and references in other media. Honestly, you'd be hard pressed to find someone who couldn't hum the main theme from The Good, the Bad and the Ugly or isn't familiar with the final showdowns at the end of all of his westerns. The mere fact that his films have become so ingrained in popular culture signifies their importance and their coolness. His characters, settings, storylines, direction, music and everything else works together to create such a cool vibe which no one else has captured quite as well as him. I believe Sergio Leone revolutionised the Western genre, and without him it would be remembered as a popular genre, sure, but he elevated it to the status it has today, with it defining an era of cinema. Westerns existed before Leone and they exist after him, but no one's quite made them as cool as he has. So I believe the answer to my question of what makes westerns so cool is Sergio Leone.